Congress and Sunday morning, and we'll talk about CBS News, its ups and downs during the turbulent 80s and today, and some of the philosophy, broadcast journalism philosophy that you've done. Welcome to another episode in our oral history series, Television in America, in which we interview those persons who've helped shape the style and substance of the medium. Many are behind the camera, writing and producing some of the most distinguished broadcasts seen on network television. Our guest today has given luster to that role. Joining CBS in 1951, he's been a producer for the Sunday morning series for the last decade. He's won 7 Emmy Awards and covered many major events of the past 45 years, from President Kennedy's assassination to Watergate to the Vietnam War. He has worked extensively with many legendary correspondents, including Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, and the late lamented Charles Kuralt. Today, on October 25th in New York, we are very pleased to welcome back a producer's producer, Bernard Birnbaum. Thank you for joining us again. Appreciate it. Bernie, one of the arenas that we covered somewhat, not completely, in our first interview here, back in June, we spanned your estimable television career from 1951 to the 60s and 70s, principally on the work you did in Vietnam with Charles Kuralt. Now, recently, there was a reunion, I understand, from you this morning of CBS correspondents, and camera and sound crews, and producers, all the folks at CBS who covered Vietnam, who were right in the thick of the action. Tell us some of the people who were there, and of course some are missing who gave their lives.
Well, you know, it's 25 years since Saigon fell. And what's interesting about 1975 is when Saigon fell, everyone remembers that great shot of the helicopters taking off, and some of the people decided that 25 years is a long time, but some of us won't be around for another 25. So we got together recently in Washington. Anyone who worked for CBS over the years came, and people hadn't seen each other in 25 years. These are some of the people who escaped on that helicopter, and some of the people who made their name in Vietnam.
Among them?
Among them, Morley Safer, and I was sitting right in back of him. And then there's Ed Bradley, who's done work in Cambodia and who says till this very day that Vietnam changed America. Then there's Dan Rather, who's way, way in the back. He didn't want to be one of the big shots. He stood practically in the shadows. And he knows that television is a cooperative medium. You have to have a great cameraman. And let's see, there was Bob Simon, who did some of the best work ever in Vietnam. And his cameraman, who stood up in the 1972 campaign when the North Vietnamese were sending in people outside away, and Simon almost got killed when he handed me the film. And he said, "If you screw this up, Bernie, I'll kill you." And those memories all came back, and all these people talking to each other and not seeing each other for 25 years. But what they did was change CBS because they were so great and took these cameras into the field with cameramen like Norman Lloyd. And and showing the action and showing what was happening to Americans bleeding to death in Vietnam, and also the South Vietnamese being slaughtered, and the suicide attempts of the North Vietnamese, knowing that when you were there, you could see that they weren't going to lose this war no matter what. And all these people coming back, and then there's Jack Lawrence. Jack Lawrence did the best work in the war of Can Tien when Marines were being killed right next to him. And he hasn't been able to get Vietnam out of his system. At this reunion, he told me he was writing a book about Vietnam. So Vietnam has not only changed the lives of all these people, it's also changed America, it's changed television, and it changed the way we report. We'll never be able to do this kind of work again because the Army and the Pentagon will never let us get to the front line. During the Gulf War, they never let us in. So everything now is spoon-fed, and the kind of living room war which you saw that these people produced is gone.
We'll come back to this in a moment. You had said when you closed the Part 1 interview, you alluded to some of that same sensitivity. You said that Vietnam was the biggest story of all. It was for Larry Burrs, who was killed at the same time as a man from Life magazine. It was the biggest story for Johnny Apple of the New York Times. It was the biggest story for David Halberstam.
Right.
Just imagine those 50,000 lives or more who were killed and how many more were wounded. It just changed America. It changed American society, you said. It took all the young middle-class kids in college and revolutionized them. We're still feeling this war every day of our lives, unquote. Let me follow up on that, Bernie, and ask you what aspects of Vietnam and the 60s, here we are, 30, almost 40 years later, we're on almost on the eve of a presidential election and so forth. How did Vietnam in the 60s continue to shape the American landscape today? How does it resonate today? How does it continue to affect our sensibility, our consciousness?
Well, what I think has happened is that because of Vietnam, everyone in America is afraid that to get involved in European affairs. You can see Bush now saying, let's pull the troops out of NATO. All this is because of Vietnam. Vietnam not only changed the military, because they said, we're never going to go in ill-prepared with the American public that doesn't understand why we're fighting this war. And that's one of the great mysteries of bringing LBJ down, because he wouldn't listen to these people who were, a few of them were telling him this is an unwinnable war, and it's only when Clark Clifford came in and told him you can't win this war and get out that he decided to do that. So I think it's not only changed the politics, it's changed the way the American people look at Washington, because they were told they were winning, and suddenly we had to have that pull out. And so I think we'll never see the kind of involvement on a scale like that. But the reason those people believed in Vietnam is they believed that Russia and China were the real people to defeat. And they weren't going to let Russia or China throw the United States off the mainland of Asia. And one day, Les Midgley, my great producer, executive producer, was standing in Vietnam with me, and we were out in the field, and he said, "You know what's wrong, Bernie?" He says, "President Johnson can't understand how these little brown people are going to defeat the United States." And that's where these little brown people, with their dedication, and there's a scene in that Bob Simon shot, and I think you should do that on Route 5. It's Firefight on Route 5. And I was up there in Way with him, and I wasn't at the front with him. And you see the destruction of North Vietnamese suicide people coming in, and South Vietnamese people shooting prisoners in the trenches, and you're seeing men being killed next to Norman Lloyd's camera, and all these things are happening, and then people go by with a bus, and a mine explodes, and women and children are lying all over the bloody on the pavement, and a woman is there crying next to the body of her loved one, and Bob Simon says, "The difference is that you can't tell. They're all Vietnamese, the North and the South, and they all look alike." And I think what these American correspondents were trying to tell Washington, that this was a revolutionary war, and they were fighting a political thing with Russia and China, and American didn't understand it. And that's what happened. And I think we're still paying that price.
Morley Safer, who is sitting where you are today, was here yesterday, October 24th, 2000. And I asked him to compare coverage and access in World War II, which he didn't cover, and in Vietnam. His feeling was that in World War II there was the so-called good fight. There was heavy censorship, which journalists understood, accepted, and so on. But in Vietnam, there was a lot of access. And because there was so much access, and because there was so much good work being done to suggest or influence, probably, the skepticism about our mission there, the military decided subsequently, in the Gulf War, for example, this is Morley's take on it, and I want yours, that never again, as long as they were in the Pentagon and so forth, would journalists, broadcast journalists or print journalists, ever have the same kind of access they did in Vietnam, the first war on television, as Morley calls it. What's your take on what Morley had to say?
Well,
comparing the two?
I'm sure that's true. I didn't cover the war.
Just going back to the days of Ernie Pyle and so forth.
Yeah, I didn't cover. But what happened was, what you have to realize is that, to get back to the most important thing Morley did, was he showed Marines using a Zippo lighter to torch the Camnay, and the man who was the sound man was in that reunion, PB Wan.
PB Wan.
Morley surrounded himself with a Vietnamese cameraman, Vietnamese soundman. He knew what was going on. These people could speak the language and tell him what was going on from the Vietnamese viewpoint. And so the important thing was that as soon as that thing was shown in America, that piece was shown in America, all hell broke loose, because the people in charge at the Pentagon said it never happened, and all those sort of things happened, where they were blaming Morley for this great exposure, making the Marines look bad. Then what happened was, the Pentagon took a black and white video, 16 millimeter film of what America was seeing, and Westmoreland was denying it. So they sent it to Westmoreland. And I was in Vietnam at the time that that film arrived from the Pentagon, off the tube. And the major who put it on the projector and showed it to Westmoreland said I had to take Westmoreland from the ceiling. He was climbing up, splattering at the ceiling. He took that film and he went up to the Marines and he said, "You're denying all this that's happened, and America has seen it." So that's what, they couldn't control the media because it was seen all over America and they couldn't deny what was happening. Therefore, the only thing they allowed us to do in the Gulf War was show the video of their smart bombs. And Bob Simon, who wandered off by himself, got picked up by the Iraqis and was put in jail. So you can't.
We'll have to get him in this chair.
You can't compare the two.
Well, with Kuralt, with Charles Kuralt, it seemed that you were both not only doing some remarkable reporting, but on a personal level, protecting each other. You told me. Tell us about that. He didn't want you to go wandering off. You were trying to keep him safe and sound. Right?
Yeah, you know, Kuralt was a genius in this medium. He never let you feel that you were just helping him. He could do everything. He could shoot. He could produce. He could direct. He had every great asset for not only a correspondent, but a producer, a director. We once sent Kuralt to Cuba during the early Castro period, and he got a visa for himself. And we gave him 50 rolls of film. And he shot 50 rolls, 100-foot rolls of black and white film. And when we're projecting it in New York, my boss, Les Midgley, said, "Why can't the New York cameraman shoot as well as Kuralt?" Kuralt could do anything. But the key to his greatness was that he's the best writer in television ever. Best writer in television ever. And that is his memorial service. Andy Rooney said, all the things we do in television go out on the air and they get lost. And what Andy Rooney said, Kuralt was as great a writer as Mark Twain.
Well,
and in 1976, for the bicentennial, he went to every state in the Union. And every week on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, there was a piece about one of the states. He started it in mid-1975, and in 1976, on 4th of July, he ended it.
When did he get
And he began it early on in 75 so that he could have every state. And I have his journal here, and it shows you he was in Nebraska and in Illinois and filming Lincoln's birthplace. And the great thing, it was at the end he decided to do New York.
Is this his own journal in his own hand?
Yeah, this is his own journal in his own hand. And the thing that separates the men from the boys in television, in my feeling, is that all the people you mentioned, Morley Safer writes every word for himself. He's a great writer. Kuralt wrote every word for himself, and he was a great poet. And if you read his poetry,
the laureate of the common man, right?
Laureate of the common man. At the end in 1976, the last thing he wrote, Mother of Exiles. And of course, he put it all in a little book. And these are just scripts, which was a bestseller for 26 weeks. How many bestsellers are just ordinary 2-minute, 3-minute, 4-minute television scripts? And I'd love to read, if he's not around to read, but if you think, whom do you think about about New York? I think about her, and he looks up to the Statue of Liberty. I think about her and Igor Sikorsky and Igor Stravinsky and Mother Cabrini and Father Flanagan and all other eyes and minds who've looked up to return her gaze. I think about her face and theirs and their photographs of images. And so if you think about what he was able to do, he says, this is the way they came to America. One day in about 1860, a boy named Carl, walking down this passageway out into the light, looked up and saw New York. That was my great-grandfather. His name was Carl Kuralt. Whatever your name is, chances are fair that your great-grandfather made the walk down this passageway too. Nearly 8 million people, the great-grandpa, a lot of us, stepped onto America right here. And we are all immigrants. Even American Indians came from someplace else. New York is a celebration of our diversity. A long way from Georgia, even longer from China. A Georgia boy got his name written in Chinese on a banner over Mott Street, and there's a shot of President Carter's name in Chinese. And this is the authentic picture of New York City, and this is the authentic sound. An Orchard Street on Lower East Side. 2 lines, a Jewish salesman. On you, that hat looks wonderful. The black customer. Wait a minute, man. Don't rush me. It's no tight little island, this New York. It's an original site of raucous American miracle, the place most of us started out from, and to which merely by walking its streets and looking in its face we can come home to. Here, Emma Lavis wrote in 1883, here at our sea-washed sunset's gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. I mean, only Kuralt can write this. Where are you going to find this in television today, this poetry?
Well,
it's like Hemingway.
We're going to find it in a piece which you wrote and produced after his death. And it's hardly an obituary. It's more of a celebration of his life and work. So suppose we roll that piece now, and we'll talk more about your association with the laureate of the common man.
He was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, on the 10th of September, 1934, to a school teacher and a social worker, and had a radio show of his own before he was old enough legally to operate a car. His mother would drive him to the station. He had evidently already settled the matter of what kind of life he wanted. You can see it in his eyes, even as a boy, and then as a young man in jacket and tie. He knew what he was meant to be, and knew too, I think, that it wouldn't take him very long. It didn't take him very long. Barely out of college in North Carolina, Charles Kuralt went to work for CBS News.
What they're practicing for is not just a game. The World Series is an event in search of a hero.
Which was where he stayed for 37 years.
It was just about here that Jacques Cartier stopped in 1534, unable to maneuver his boat past the rapids of the St. Lawrence River. Where he stopped, other men are beginning on this April afternoon in 1959. This is where the St. Lawrence Seaway begins.
In a moment, an eyewitness report on Cuba today by correspondent Charles Kuralt.
He stayed at CBS News, yes, but he did not stay put. From the very first, Charles Kuralt was a traveling man.
The Bossa Nova's been hanging around in this alley in Copacabana for a long time, a new cult waiting for some members. The tourists all walked right by on their way to the big nightclubs, where the samba reminded them that they were in Brazil, and where the twist reminded them that by jet they're only 9.5 hours from the Peppermint Lounge. Dismissed by his employer, deserted by his union, unneeded by his community, ignored by his country, except for $56 a month in food stamps, I.B. Johnson mines only enough coal now to keep his own family warm. And nobody pays him for that.
He liked to say that he never was a real reporter. That wasn't true. He was.
Everything you're about to see took place in Vietnam on Christmas and on the days just preceding Christmas. We thought you might be interested to know what it was like.
He went to all the dangerous places reporters are supposed to go.
That morphine will take hold in about 15 minutes.
Alpha Oscar, this is Alpha November, over.
If you're the kind who prays, you might pray that these other brave men, the 3rd Platoon of A Company, all leave this terrible place safely and come home to you next Christmas. The temperature is only about 10.
And he went to some places no one is supposed to go.
The thing about the Arctic in the spring is that you go along with beautiful weather, the sun shining down, blue sky overhead, a gentle breeze, and then a blow like this comes along to remind you where you are.
And in all those places, he did brilliant, memorable work.
People who come from towns where the streets are named Oak or Maple or Maine are always disturbed by the cold, anonymous sound of New York street names. It's true that 117th isn't exactly the most romantic or imaginative name for a street, but you shouldn't conclude from that 117th Street is just a line on the crosstown grid of Manhattan. This block between Lenox and 7th is as interesting and varied as your block.
If you begin to get a little tall, I ought to pack up my things and haul.
He always got the facts, of course.
117th Street still exerts its pull on people. They call themselves 17th Streeters, and even those who grew up here and moved away often come back.
But he got something else, too. Something that other reporters tend to miss. He got the meaning of the story. And he put the meaning in such a way that we came to think we had known it all along. Only we hadn't.
As high as you can go on 117th Street is to the 5th floor rooftops. Up there you can keep pigeons, or read a book, or make love, or occasionally be alone if that's what you want, but you cannot go higher.
He made it sound like folk wisdom, burnished over time. But it was his wisdom, burnished by his writing and his skill.
A country of 14 million people, a sovereign nation among the nations of the world, in which there is not one doctor, not one lawyer, no courts and no judges, and in which the only law is the rule of violence. This is the Congo.
As it turned out, however, danger was not what interested him.
I have miles and miles ahead of me.
Decency was what interested him. And so in 1967, in his own country, in a bus, he set out in search of that.
Oh, he said he was the best, and I trusted him.
Oh, yeah, Joe.
Philosopher Diogenes wandered ancient Greece, lantern in hand, looking, in vain he feared, for even one honest man. Charles Kuralt did better than Diogenes.
This is a song you'll never hear again, the song of the Gandhi dancer.
Oh, lay my ball in the middle of the pack, ain't gonna lie to the captain bag, baby, mama.
He found honest men, and honest women, too, by the hundreds.
The man moaning in the background is our cameraman. Mr. Blackman had just been put through a snap roll by a little old lady of 80.
That's good for your veins.
And directed our attention to them for 25 years on the road.
Bill Patch is one of those American tinkerers. By tinkering with valves and pipes in an old tea kettle, he converted his Nash Rambler to corncob power.
Well, if we could just get that right combination there.
Nobody could accuse you of wasting any string lately.
No, not.
He had already been to every state of the Union by the time he did that all over again in a single year for the bicentennial of this country, filing one report from each state every week for 50 weeks for the CBS Evening News.
This is town meeting day.
And he went, or so it began to seem, to every hamlet of every state, too.
He was shot through the heart.
No matter how out of the way his destination may have been, he always brought meaning back with him.
John A. Mathis, June 10th, 1856.
What was it that animated him? I asked him that once, not too long ago. I'm not calling for you to criticize your journalistic colleagues here, but it seems to me admiration is in sort of short supply, generally speaking, in the world of reporting.
Well, it's unsophisticated, isn't it, to admire your subject? You're supposed to investigate your subject and have a healthy skepticism about what he says. I suspended my skepticism a long time ago. It's so much more fun, though unsophisticated, maybe even unprofessional in a journalist. It's so much more fun just to sit there and enjoy the guy and learn a few things.
Come meet a school of mermaids, if maids is the right word. Don't you feel a little old for this?
No, we go on the theory that growing old is only a bad habit that a busy person has no time to form.
He watched us and learned a few things. We watched him and learned a lot. About mailboxes and clotheslines. About a man who provided bicycles to children who would not have had them otherwise. About a landlocked farmer with a dream of the sea. About some men who made a bridge, and one man who made bricks all his long life. About a scholar in a cabin in the woods, and small towns. About an American born in Russia who went home finally late in his life to bring tears to the eyes of his countrymen. And about another old man of Russia who never did leave, but who waited 50 years for someone to carry his message of gratitude to the American soldiers who saved his life during the Second World War. We learned about steam engines and dominoes and a doctor you could pay with a handshake. We learned about a league of women who banded together once upon a time to feed a multitude, and a road builder working all by himself, and a fisherman, and a jogger of 104.
Humiliated by a 104-year-old man.
It was a nonfiction novel he was writing in installments over the course of a long career, the theme of which was that the heartland of this country extends from coast to coast, from the Black Hills to the Rio Grande, and from Puget Sound to the Florida Keys. We all inhabit the heartland, we learned. And now we all think we knew these people from the first, and these truths. But we didn't, and never would have known them without this Walt Whitman carrying a reporter's pad, who heard America singing, and who went out to collect its songs so we could hear them too.
Good morning. Here begins something new.
He had a regular stand as well for 15 years on this broadcast. Here too, all along, decency was his interest. Before Charles Kuralt and Sunday Morning came along, there was no place on television for this country's great makers of music or of art, or for the great contributors to its spirit. He made a place for them. From the giants of our day to the small stories that turned out not to be small, he preserved for us every reason we have as a country to be hopeful. How much would we have overlooked? How much would we have forgotten? How much would we have failed to understand had we not had the chance to see ourselves through his eyes?
Lovely tribute, an elegant work, Bernie. Really Wonderful.
But nothing can match this man's writing. You know, when you what happened was we put together 475 stories of On the Road for the Travel Channel. Some of these stories are 25 years old, and they still hold up. They hold up because of the writing. It's the writing, it's the poetry. I mean, wherever you open this book of Charles Kuralt scripts, you can hear his voice, no matter what had happened. The one I like to think about is one that he did in '76, Little Bighorn in Montana. This is a place where the wind blows and the grass grows and the river flows below a hill. Nothing is here but the wind and the grass and the river. Best of all places in America, this is the saddest place I know. The Indians call the river Greasy Grass. White men call it Little Bighorn. And it talks about Custer and the cavalry and all that.
He had a great economy of writing also.
That's right.
It was not over.
This is the saddest place for Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Courage only led to defeat. For Crazy Horse and the Sioux, victory only led to Wounded Knee. Come here sometimes and you'll see there is melancholy in the wind and sorrow in the grass, and the river weeps. This is poetry. Where do you hear this on television today? I don't think Kuralt could get a job today. He's too fat. No one's interested in this kind of prose, this kind of writing. And when you think about it, the only people who are carrying on good writing are the few people who can show that they can still write. And I think that's what separates the men and the boys.
Well, also, Kuralt, with you, had the great ability to merge word and picture, because television writing should not be redundant. You're saying what you're saying, you don't necessarily have to caption. Tell us how you see television writing. What's your take on television writing, and how Kuralt and you worked so well together?
How we worked together? Well, first of all, the point is that when we worked out shooting, he kept great notes. And then when he could, he would project the film and make his own notes. And then when he wrote the script, he would tell you what role and what shot and what page it was on. He didn't leave anything to chance. And the key to his greatness was that he once said to a group of students, and I remember there were 2 lecturers to this student, Andy Rooney and Kuralt. And Kuralt brought Andy Rooney along because he felt he didn't have enough to say. But the only thing he did say is he says, I never put a word in the typewriter without thinking of what the picture is. He wrote to picture. And it wasn't the average correspondent sit down, write, and hand it to the editor and say, stitch it together. It was stitched together in his mind. With every shot, he knew what he was going to say, and he could also know when to let the picture take over. And he thought in terms of film in such a way that when we were still shooting 16 millimeter, I remember I said, where do you want this particular shot? And he said, I want it over that frame, that word over that frame. He was talking in 24ths of a second. the impact of that word over that particular frame. And that's the juxtaposition of the word and the picture coming to make together and creating what I call the third force. The word by itself doesn't mean anything. And the picture helps showing by itself doesn't mean anything. But when you put Kuralt's word to those pictures, it gives it another meaning. And what keeps it so simple is the words are so simple. And the pictures are simple. And it's what he was able to do with this poetry. And of course, the great cameraman he had, Izzy Bleckman, who shot 99% of everything he ever did.
How about the editors?
And the editors were able to take and find material and little bits of sound and even make it better. So it's the idea of, he was the first to say you needed this team.
That's
but he couldn't do it himself, but the trouble was he could do it himself.
But in the beginning, television, like everything else, in the beginning there was the word.
Right. Well, you know, what happens if you look at 60 Minutes today, which is a successful, they're interested in the word. And what proves the pudding of it is that now on radio, it's 7 o'clock in New York. 60 Minutes is broadcast on WCBS radio, and it's a radio show. So it shows that the words are more important than the picture.
Absolutely.
So here you have a radio show also becoming a television show, and a successful one.
2 television shows, right?
Right.
Tell us about your association. You worked with Charles Kuralt, excuse me, very early in network television at CBS.
Right.
And that association spanned all the way through from the 50s to Vietnam to On the Road.
Right.
And to Sunday Morning.
Right.
At last. Were you on the bus with Kuralt?
Occasionally, I would go occasionally.
What was life like on that bus?
Well, I tell you, you know, I didn't go on the bus that often. I'd finish stories for him. But there was a period in 83 and 84 where we had half-hour programs on the road, and hour programs with American Parade and things of that nature, where we'd go out and we had to fill a half hour every week. Kuralt couldn't do it himself. There were stories that I did completely on my own, which thank God he put in the book, because what happened was we had an executive producer, Russ Bensley, who could write for Kuralt. And one day in the cutting room, Kuralt said, "You know, I can't believe I didn't write this." Now that happened 5 or 10% of the time, because for that year we couldn't do enough, fill a half hour every week with him. So, but what happened is they from the late 60s to when the thing started, after he got back from Vietnam and the North Pole, he went into Mr. Salant, the president, and he said he'd like to do this show.
President of CBS News.
Right.
Richard Salant.
Right, and he said, "I'd like to do these stories which aren't on the front pages." And this was in 68. We just had Tet and 68 convention, and he wanted to go and show America wasn't falling apart. There was the part of America which
was intact.
Most were old people and back roads, and to get this back road, these heroes who weren't on the front pages.
So the signature, the mission of On the Road, and tell me that, and why was it so successful?
Well, it was successful because what happened was they were very smart Mr. Midgley and Mr. Liza, who were executive producer of the evening news with Cronkite, realized that on Friday evening you needed a kicker at the end of the program, which wasn't blood and guts. And they let it run as long as it had to, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. And people started to turn into this thing, which was so special and so American. And he was able to capture this because ideas would come in over the transom, and he was able to but the important thing is the writing. You know, it wasn't just, how can you do a small town, you know? And what happened was, if you look at what he was able to do, he was able to, the first thing he did was he picked unlikely heroes.
That's what I want to know.
And the unlikely heroes was the Bird Lady of St. Petersburg,
Okay.
right? Or the North Platte Canteen, the women who greeted the soldiers. And then he did different drummers. Horse trader, the man who made carousels, the singing mailman in Kentucky, the black man who made bricks by hand and got a big contract from the tobacco company to build a whole town with handmade bricks. Then he made misspellings. He picked up signs, and he did stories about hamburgers. And then he did the canoe maker. Then he did the pioneer of the road, the croquet player, the pilot you saw, the woman who was the great pilot, Nicky the chicken man. Nicky was in Hartford, and he wouldn't sell his chicken place to the big Hartford insurance company.
But what was the common signature of all of these people? That
everyone was different. Here he has the poets and others, the poet of steam, the bridge builders, the men who built the Golden Gate Bridge.
They were all different, but they were all the same in what respect?
They were heroes who were great Americans who talked about their lives, and Kuralt realized what heroic people they were. Imagine these bridge builders in San Francisco during the Depression, and they fell into the nets, and the bosses would say, if you want to quit, there were 10 guys down below who were ready to take your spot. Moonshiners. I did moonshiners with them. We went all through the South and did stills. The auctioneer, talking about America.
You weren't arrested for making...
No, we weren't. The oystering, the last of the oysterers. Wonderful. And then he did the Tall Tales and Dreamers, the American Weather, the Prospector, the Cadillac Ranch, the man who stuck Cadillacs up in the ranch.
That's terrific. Where can we see all these today?
Yeah, well, the Travel Channel.
Well, we've seen snippets in the last piece.
We could see snippets of it. And then he did Small Towns. And he did the editor of the Small Town, and the man who, then the coffee cups. And then he did the parking meter, the one parking meter in one town. And then he did the sponge fisherman in Tappan Springs, Florida. And then he did Passing the Torch. And he did the kite flyer. And he did the woman who drank strong coffee and was over 100 and still saving money for her pension.
He sang of unsung Americans.
Right. Then he did American Sweet.
Bernie, how did On the Road, which became, as you said, the Friday night kicker, the back of the book, something to close out the week and give people some, leave a good feeling that this country still works.
Right.
How did that evolve, if you will, into Sunday morning and into larger pieces
Well,
on Sunday morning?
what happened was the way we sold it, it was that I was going to take the best of the Sunday morning of the on the road and make an hour program out of it every few years, and I did, and those were the highest rated half hours and hours, and you can imagine that after 20 years, I did 20 years on the road, and it was unprecedented that IBM bought every commercial, and then the next year they came and wanted another hour. So what we did was some of these programs were shown on the evening news, and then I showed them on the hour shows, and then I replayed them on 20 years after the classics.
This is all the 70s and 80s.
Right.
When does Sunday morning come about now? And how does it come about?
It came about because we were smart at CBS to realize that let's create a Sunday newspaper with magazines, and news, and I suppose they figured out that it should be something like the Sunday New York Times with different sections. So they created people who specialized in jazz. They got Billy Taylor. Then they got Eugenia Zuckerman to do music. And then now they have John Leonard reviewing books and film. So what happened was Kuralt was the natural who decided that he was going to give it this stamp. But of course, in the early days, he had Northshield, who was the executive producer.
Robert Shad Northshield,
who just passed away.
Yes. He did?
Yeah, just passed away.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
We've interviewed him. It's
and so...
I'm terribly sorry to hear that.
But what Kuralt would come in on Saturday and rewrite the few little openings and closings. And what happened was there was an hour in the early days on Sunday, which was Look Up and Live and Lamp Unto My Feet, which were two religious programs which the religious organizations would have a say in how they allotted that time. So there'd be the Catholics and the Protestants and the Jews and the Baptists and all the various people would talk to that. And they decided to get rid of that hour and give it to Sunday morning.
On the Road and Sunday Morning both marked eras of excellence for CBS News, but there was soon trouble in paradise. What was life like for veterans like yourself when CBS News, for example, was under Van Gordon Sauter and all the turbulence? Can you talk to that?
Well, what happened was with Sunday morning, they had so many problems with ratings that they never bothered us. We were a peripheral problem early Sunday morning. Who cared? For a while, they wanted to change it, but they never got around to it. But now what's happened in the last year is they've started to pay attention to it. And so they've changed executive producers, and they've put younger people in who come from 48 hours and 60 minutes, and they've changed the format, but they've made things a little shorter, a little snappier, but everyone is now constrained by money. The networks are a machine to make money, and if they don't make money, and not only make money, they want you to do things with very little. In other words, you're constrained now. You can't shoot as long. You can't shoot as much. You can't travel as far. All these things are constrained because the bottom line is what's important.
You don't have as many bureaus, and that began under, started to diminish, did it not, under Larry Tisch?
Yeah, Larry Tisch
correct?
went to London one day, and he looked around, and he saw that they had, for some reason, they brought all the people, even the people who worked London at night. The night people came in. He looked around. He said, "My God, all these people." So the trouble with Larry Tisch was he didn't realize that this is a different business than insurance
and,
company.
yeah,
And so the
whatever
first
else
thing
they
they did
had.
was they fired hundreds of people. One day they fired 250 people at
remember that
CBS.
massacre.
A real massacre. And I think I'm lucky that I was saved that day. I think I was saved because of Charles Kuralt. I think he said
earned
to
it.
somebody in power that if you fire Birnbaum, you can fire me. And I think I was saved. But there were a lot of good people who got fired that day.
I hope they landed on their feet somewhere
Some of
else.
them, yeah.
How about today? We'll just continue toward this finale. Under the Westinghouse folks and Mel Karmazin and so on, does that same bottom line become?
Well, we're lucky that
more
we
delineated?
that Sunday Morning was able to improve its ratings after Kuralt left. The ratings went down, but now they've come back up.
Under
And
Charles
Osgood has been able to hold on to them. And so as long as your ratings are 20% better than they were a few months ago, things are good. Because CBS has so many other problems with the older audience that they can't seem to understand. So we even on Sunday Morning now are trying to get a younger audience. We're shortening the things, making them a little more. Instead of having a 6 or 7 minute piece about art, we'll have a minute and a half or 2 minutes about and call it like an almanac of what's happening. Mm-hmm. And we're using local stations to give us more of their material. So I think, you know, even the famous shows which are making money are have to be careful, because everyone's under the Paleys and the Stantons in the old days. The news department didn't have to make money. In fact, one day when I started to work with some of the people from Friendly's CBS Reports, they came over to help us out in the early 60s. I said, be careful, we have this budget, we can't go over it. And they said, what's a budget? In other words, Friendly and Murrow really didn't have a budget. They reported to Paley and they did what they had to do. But now, everyone has to live within the budget. You only have so many days, so many crew days. You can use a crew for a certain length of time, and you can't go over that.
And the overnight ratings, that's a new phrase in newsrooms, or
yes.
In that era, you never heard
well, even
Nielsen's and so on.
No,
now
we
it's
never
the first
did.
thing you hear about.
Well, you can see if you read today's New York Times, the woman who was Pat Mitchell, who's taken over PBS. She's getting a younger, some failed Fox show. She's going to try to get younger people in. She's getting local stations to do things for PBS. So even PBS is involved in these things now.
Well, we began this hour talking about network news. So sum up your feelings for us today, Bernie, if you will, at a time when the long form or the elegant news magazines, such as 60 Minutes and Sunday Morning, is an endangered species, or it's healthy. Those two are healthy, but not many. There's not much long form. When TV, magazines prevail, many of them of the Dumb and Dumber tabloid format. Has H.L. Mencken's line truly come to pass that you can never go broke underestimating the intelligence of the American people? What's going on in television today where it's Survivor and all that other unmentionable stuff becomes part of the news?
I think when I started in television in 1953, I became a film editor and with Charles Collingwood and.
Whose tie you're wearing today?
Wearing Charles Collingwood's tie. For the first 8 years, I worked on programs which had no commercials. Adventure with the Museum of Natural History. Yes. We did. Charles Collingwood was the narrator, and we had Margaret Mead on. We had Margaret Mead's boss, Dr. Shapiro. We did programs like The Family of Man with Steichen and Sandberg.
Steichen, yes.
Yeah, I'll give you a copy of that. You could see, I mean, Steichen is next to his brother-in-law, the great photographer Steichen, and he's talking about The Family of Man, and we did a half-hour show, and I said, let's just pan the photographs and create a new type of television using stills. And these were great stills. You couldn't go wrong. So none of these programs that I worked on for the Museum of Natural History and Museum of Modern Art had a commercial. Why? Because Paley was making so much money with I Love Lucy and all the other programs that they let the news department or these cultural things go on for years without even bothering to sell them because they worried about their licenses. And today, NBC didn't even bother to carry the presidential debates. Can you imagine the networks not starting with the presidential debates? So what's happened is Fox didn't carry the presidential debates. They say we're going to cable. Now this is really a crime. Even the New York Times had to say these people are using the airwaves, which we've given them free in the public interest, and they don't have the decency to give 1 hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours every 4 years. They're so greedy. That shows you where we've come today. You don't have to look at the bottom line or the cutting or the people they fired, or you just use that as an example.
Steve Scheuer, who makes all these interviews, oral histories possible, usually when he's sitting where I am as a surrogate for him, offers his guests the proverbial magic wand and asks, what would you do, Bernie, if you had that magic wand to change television or television news and public affairs today? What would you do if Steve gave you that wand?
I would cause the FCC to ask all the people who own these licenses of what they're doing in the public interest. Suddenly, years ago when Channel 11 put some PIX here in New York, put on some phony stuff, they almost lost their license.
Right, to Forum.
What?
It was a challenge by the Forum group.
Right, you remember that. And so I think the fact that these great organizations think of this only as a means to make money rather than a little bit of public interest. And I think I think we have to change that so that there's some responsibility on the part of that, of these people.
Yes, the Forum group is
right.
Larry Grossman and Jack CUNY and some other terrific people. And I'm glad that PIX shaped up at any rate.
You remember that?
Yes, I do, since
Yeah.
I knew both of them. So what does the future hold?
The future holds that you have still a few people who still want to do the good fight. And I think the good fight is being done by the three anchors. I mean, Dan Rather, Brokaw, and at ABC,
Peter Jennings.
Peter Jennings. I mean, those are three great men from the older period who still write books. Brokaw has written 2 or 3 good books. Rather has written about his, and I know that they feel deeply about this, and they're fighting the good fight. But how long those guys will still be in those chairs to fight that? I think when they go, all sorts of hell is going to break loose as far as we're concerned for the quality of the 3 networks. I mean, you can't talk about Fox, and you can't talk. And the problem is that CNN was trying to do something good, but they fired Mr. Kaplan recently. So everyone is saying, why can't we get the ratings? Why can't we get the young people? And today, as you know, even PBS is trying that. So I think we can't say anything until the 3 great men, Rather, Brokaw, and Peter Jennings, leave the scene. While they're still on the scene, their personalities are still fighting the good fight. I mean, they're fighting all the time.
As are
and
producers like yourself.
Well, no, I think what happened was you can see
a lot of other colleagues.
Yeah, and
the 60 Minutes group.
And the 60 Minutes group. Now, Wallace is over 81 or 2 years old. I mean, and I'm 80. How much longer have we got?
As long as the spirit keeps you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Bernard Birnbaum. You keep the torch aglow, and we appreciate you being here with us again.
The point is, we were really honored to remember these guys. These were the people who were able to make television work. These were the people who could write and match that picture in such a way that America felt it. And when he died, thousands of letters came into CBS, which I saved. And people felt, the interesting thing is that he came to your living room. He was in your home. He was a member of your family. And you spoke to him, and you felt you knew him. And he wasn't an actor, he really was a poet. And that's the why we were able to reach and touch so many people, because the camera doesn't lie. What you got on the screen with Kuralt was exactly the way he'd be sitting here today. That's the difference.
I would say one of his best achievements or best decisions was to say, I want to continue working with Bernard Birnbaum.
Right.
And we thank you.
And you know what happened was, when he wrote this book, I'm so proud. I've depended heavily on Neil Nyren, editor and general, for advice and consent on upon several of my associates at CBS for generous assistance. Of these, I wish to acknowledge first and foremost Bernard Birnbaum, an inspirational friend to me and gadfly. What does a gadfly mean? I don't know.
It's like keeping somebody kosher. It's stinging. It's the establishment, stinging the establishment. It's comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. That's
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.